Hello, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, I'm sharing my screen. So we'll go ahead and we're done with the journal import soap service yesterday, and we did we're done with journal import soap service yesterday, which is our first web service based integration, and we're going to start off with complex AP invoice REST API. And let me just show you that integration, guys, before we create it, so that you know what integration we are about to build. I'm signing into OIC instance, and I'll open up the API created for a previous batch. And I would open up UJ62 journal import service. Sorry, not the journal import service, my bad. AP Invoice REST API. So we're going to build this AP Invoice REST API now. And again, what's the expectation, guys? For this integration, yes, we need to build an integration, a complex REST API. And from one single integration, we would see how to expose two different branches. One post branch, which would help us create, or which would help the clients create AP invoice in the cloud. Okay, so when client hits this endpoint, the post endpoint, they would pass an invoice and line details as input. And from this particular branch, what exactly are we going to do? We would be whatever details that we receive. So we would, to this particular endpoint, we would receive invoice and invoice line details as input from the other system. And we need to plug in logic in this branch to go to ERP Cloud and create an AP invoice there. And from the other branch, and after we create AP invoice in ERP Cloud, we are going to send the response back to the calling client here. And in that response, we would also include the invoice ID and the other details. Now, sometimes clients want to verify whether that invoice ID corresponds to the exact invoice details that we have sent or not. Okay, so they want to do a cross verification, whatever invoice ID that we send them back. So does that invoice ID correspond to the same invoice details that they have sent earlier or not? So we need to expose another get endpoint. And to this get endpoint, they're going to pass an invoice ID as input. And in this get branch, we need to plug in logic to get the invoice details from ERP Cloud based on invoice ID. And after we get the invoice details, we send some of the details back. And we're going to build this integration as a synchronous service. We're going to build this integration as a synchronous service. So whether the client invokes or whether the customer invokes this endpoint or this endpoint, we are going to send the response back. Okay, so when we send the response back, we would be able to see, when we send the response back, since we have a written element, when client triggers either this endpoint or this endpoint, they would be waiting for you to do the action and send back a response. So since it is only one REST API call that we need to do, either to create AP invoice or get AP invoice details, so that's fine to make the client wait for a minute or so. Meanwhile, you create a AR invoice or AP invoice in ERP Cloud, and we send the details back. Now, yes, I need to build an integration which is capable of importing AP invoice in ERP Cloud or get the invoice details based on invoice ID. Now, how are we going to, from this REST API, how are you going to achieve those CRUD operations in Fusion Cloud? So the first thing that I need to do is, as usual, I have to go into the documentation page. And I need to see if there is a REST API, first of all, to deal with invoices. So I go into integrate, going to review REST APIs. And what should I search for, guys? Invoices. I could see that there is an invoices resource, and it is basically a payables invoice resource. Remember, you also have another resource for receivables invoice. That's a different story. And this payables invoice resource, what endpoints do you see here? We have an endpoint to create an invoice. We have an endpoint to get an invoice details based on invoice ID. And not just these two, you also have plenty of other REST APIs as well. You also have plenty of other REST APIs as well, other REST endpoints. Now, from the integration that we're going to build, since we are exposing only two REST endpoints, create and get AP invoice details. From the create endpoint, we're going to call this create an invoice endpoint. And from the get endpoint, from our REST API, we are going to call this get an invoice endpoint. Okay, so we would call get an invoice endpoint from here, and we will call create an invoice endpoint from here. Now, to call these standard REST APIs given by Oracle, whether it is create an invoice or get an invoice details, what exactly do we need to do, guys? Whether you have to create an AP invoice or create an invoice, or whether it is to get a specific invoice details, what exactly we need to do?
We need to invoke.
How can we invoke them? One obvious way to invoke these REST endpoints is, which connection can we use to invoke them?
ERP Cloud.
ERP Cloud.
ERP Cloud connection, right? So one single ERP Cloud connection, the same connection that we used earlier, we can use it to create an invoice here and to get the invoice details. But what I want to do is, in the create branch, I'll show you how to make use of ERP Cloud connection to invoke this create endpoint. But from the get endpoint, you would go ahead and invoke a REST API using a REST adapter. Okay. From the get endpoint, from the get branch, we're going to invoke a REST endpoint. And we would invoke this REST API not using ERP Cloud connection. We can still use it here as well. But instead of using ERP Cloud connection in this branch, we would use a REST adapter to invoke this REST API. Now, why do I want to show you how to use a REST invoke connection to invoke the REST APIs, guys? The reason is, if I show you how to use ERP connection here as well, okay, that's okay, you will practice this integration. But tomorrow, Abhinav needs to build another integration, and his integration, he needs to invoke a REST API given by ADP, a payroll vendor. Would Abhinav be able to invoke a REST API given by ADP here using ERP Cloud connection, guys? Yes or no, please?
No.
Certainly no, right? Because ERP Cloud connection will help you to invoke only Oracle ERP and the REST APIs. In such cases, you wouldn't know what you have to do. So just to help you with such sort of scenarios, what I would do was, in the first branch, I'll show you how to use ERP Cloud connection to invoke standard REST APIs. We can very well use the same approach in a GET as well. But instead of doing that approach, we would make use of a REST invoke connection to invoke a standard REST API. Okay, don't think that ERP doesn't work here. Okay, ERP still works, but it's just that I wanted to show you how to invoke a non-Oracle REST APIs. Sorry. Just wanted to show you how to invoke a REST API with a REST adapter, REST invoke connection, so that you can use this approach for any scenario. As usual, before we build the integration, what do we need, guys? We need to create the connections. How many connections we need for this integration? We need a REST trigger connection. We need a REST trigger connection, first of all, to start the integration. And we need ERP connection, right? Yes or no? ERP connection, and we already have it. And we also need REST invoke connection. So this is a REST invoke connection, and this is a REST trigger connection. Please note the difference, guys. This is a REST trigger connection, and this is a REST invoke connection. So we need 3 connections in total. Okay, let's create those connections first. AP invoice REST trigger connection, and I'm going to create the connection with a role as trigger. And I'm going to select the authentication as basic auth. And we already have ERP connection, and ERP connection is already pointing to a working instance, ETAQ instance. That's fine. And we also need one more REST connection. And I'm going to call this as UG62. I'm going to call it as ERP REST connection. So I'm creating this connection with the REST adapter, and I'm going to use this REST connection to invoke the REST APIs, in ERP Cloud. Since I'm going to use this connection to invoke REST APIs in ERP Cloud, I'm going to just give it a meaningful name. I call it as ERP REST connection. ERP REST connection. And when you create a REST invoke connection, if it is a REST trigger connection, what would happen, guys? Do we have to enter any details, guys, if it's a REST trigger connection?
No.
We just select a security policy there, right? We just created one trigger connection, right? So let me just open that and show you. So I just created this REST trigger connection. If it is a REST trigger connection, we just select the authentication policy. We just select the authentication policy. And we don't enter any other details here. But if it is a REST invoke connection, we cannot, apart from entering the security details here, we also need to enter the connection details. Okay. Now, what exactly are we going to select in the REST invoke connection, guys, in the connection properties? If it is, so there are two ways you can invoke REST APIs, guys. If it is an implemented REST API, and if you have the endpoint URL, then you can use REST API based URL as an option. Remember, what is the endpoint that we want to call? It is this endpoint that we want to call, and it says it is this endpoint that we want to call. So these are the two endpoints we need to call. Now, since this is an implemented REST API that we need to invoke, what I can do is I can make use of REST API based URL. And within the connection based URL, what is it that you normally enter, guys? Whatever is the path that you prefix to these URLs, right? So tell me one thing, guys, if I have to create an invoice, is this a complete path that I can invoke, guys?
No, we have to embed.
Include server.
We need
server
to include the prefix a ERP Cloud instance link. So if I have to create ERP Cloud, if I have to create AP invoice in this particular application, what do I have to do? So I need to put in the ERP base URL first. And after that, I would copy this path and paste it in there. So this is the complete path. So this is going to be my relative path, and this is going to be my base URL. So whatever is the prefix that you're going to do, that you're going to add to all the REST endpoints that you see here, whatever is the prefix that you're going to add to all the paths that you see here, that is exactly what you call as a base URL. Now, since this is a REST endpoint that I want to call, I can add this as a REST API base URL. I can add it as a REST API base URL here, and I would enter the connection details. And sometimes what happens, guys? Sometimes, so let's say a vendor is still building the REST API and they have not created it yet. So in such case, what you can do, instead of doing a REST API based URL, what exactly are you going to do? You would say open API specification. Instead of REST API, what exactly are you going to do? You would say open API specification. Remember, guys, when we did the Hello World Soap service, what did we use as a starting point, guys? In the trigger connection, what did we use? We used abstract WSDL file. Anyone still remembers that, guys? We use this abstract WSDL file in that Hello World Soap service. And what is this abstract WSDL file, guys? It's basically a specification for a SOAP web service. Similar to how you can create a specification for a SOAP web service first and then build the integration to implement the logic, in an exactly similar fashion, you can also create a specification for REST API in Open API format. And if the specification is created already, even though the REST API is not created, you can still enter that Open API specification URL here. you can invoke a REST API with the help of endpoint URL or through the Open API specification URL. I'm not sure how many of you already noticed it, guys, but when you build a REST API in OIC, when you build a REST API in OIC, and when you activate it, what would happen, guys? If you look at the details here, if you look at the endpoint data, you see after you build the REST API, there is an endpoint URL generated. And for this integration, there is also a specification generated in two different formats, guys. Swagger and Open API are two different formats in which you can create a specification for a REST API, guys. So if I have to call this REST API, I can make use of this endpoint URL. Okay, I can make use of this endpoint URL. Or I can go into Open API specification. And when you go into Open API specification, what exactly you see, guys? This is nothing but a specification for your REST API. This is nothing but a specification for your REST API. And what exactly do you see in the specification, guys? You see it is in Open API format. What is the name of the integration? What's the version number? What is the REST endpoint URL? What are the paths configured? What is it that you receive as input? And what are the responses that you're going to send back? Okay, so you would be able to see all the details here. And if you go into Swagger, you would also be able to see the REST API specification details. So yes, and these two URLs are given here. So if I want to trigger a REST API, I can either make use of this REST endpoint URL itself, or I can also make use of a specification as well generated for that endpoint URL. Two different ways. And only Open API specification is supported, or the REST API based URL, either this or this. We cannot use Swagger. Okay, but in this case, what is it that we want to do? Since it is an implemented web service, we wanted to make use of the ERP cloud connection itself as a base URL. So that what would happen is when I use this connection in the integration, when I say I want to invoke a REST API, if I have to call this one, I just have to mention this as a relative path. Because whatever I need to prefix ERP URL to this, and that ERP URL is anyways added as a base URL in the connection. And we need to enter the connection details here, guys, in IAMPL username and the password. Now, one important point here, guys, when you enter a username and password here for that Fusion Cloud instance, be very careful with the password, guys. It is your responsibility to enter a right password here, because even if you don't enter a right password, you see I'm putting in 1 at the end, you test it. What does it say? Connection tested successfully. But is it a right password, guys?
No.
No. So what you need to be careful about is, so sometimes I get this question from the students, Prasad, the connection is going through successfully, but I'm not able to use this. But when I use the connection, the integration, etc. What's the reason? The reason is they didn't put in the right password. And if it is a REST invoke connection, remember the user and password would not be validated. So it's your responsibility to get the connection password right. Now we need all three connections, guys. We have all three of them. So it's time to go ahead and build an integration. And we create a new integration, app-driven orchestration. And once it is, since it's an app-driven orchestration, what would happen after you build the integration? There would be a URL generated. So I'm going to say UG62 or UG63 AP Invoice REST API. And I'm going to create it. AP Invoice REST API, I'm going to create it. Now, after I create the integration, what would happen? You see that we need to enter a configure a trigger connection first. Now you see AP Invoice REST trigger connection, use that as a trigger. And we say, I'm going to just call it as AP Invoice. You just give it a generic name, first of all. So you enter a generic name here for the trigger point. And from this trigger connection, so you enter the generic name called AP invoice. From this REST API, how many branches you want to expose, guys? How many resources or verbs you want to expose? Two branches, right? At least you can do up to 12, up to 11, guys. From a single integration in OIC, we can expose up to 11 branches. Now you might say, Prasad, what if we need more? If you need more, you have to create a different REST API. Now we need at least two REST, or we wanted to show you how to do at least two REST endpoints or two branches from a single integration. So I'm going to tick this box saying that I want to configure multiple resources or verbs. So once you select it, what would happen? When you go to the next screen, you would configure your first operation first. Okay, you would configure the first branch and then we configure the second branch. So what's the first branch? Give a name to the endpoint. So I'm going to say create AP invoice. And this operation is going to create AP invoice in ERP code. And what's the relative path that you want to mention here, guys? Remember, guys, the relative path that you enter in a trigger connection is your choice, guys. Is your choice. So you can say ABC, you can say XYZ. Doesn't really matter, guys. You can enter any path that you want here. Absolutely not a problem. Absolutely not a problem. Okay. And you just have to enter a slash in there. And I would just call it as slash invoice. I would just call it a slash invoice. Or I can say, to give it a meaningful name, I'll just say create AP invoice. And when you do a create operation, guys, when you do a create operation from any of the branch, when you're trying to create something in ERP or any other application for that matter, we need to expose that endpoint as a post endpoint. That's an industry standard, guys. Okay, please do bear this in mind. Whenever you're creating something in ERP cloud, you need to enter a post endpoint. And we would mention this as, and we need to say, yes, it is a post endpoint. And we need to configure a request and a response payload for this. Okay, because of course, when client hits this endpoint, right, they're not going to just say that Prasad create an invoice and they don't let me know the details with which invoice needs to be created. Of course, they have to pass in a request payload and I want to send them back a response. And I just go ahead and click continue. And you say JSON sample here. And I can enter a JSON sample in line. And what exactly we need to enter as a JSON sample. Now, this is where what I did is I went to the standard documentation screen, create an invoice. And when you try to create an invoice, remember in this endpoint, we would have a sample request payload. We have a sample request payload to create an AP invoice. Now, let me show you how the invoice looks like, guys, in ERP cloud. So where do we find the payables invoice, first of all? What group we need to go into? We need to go into payables group. But looks like we're not able to see the payables group, right? So what do? Any of the group, you click on a plus icon, search for payables, and you can enable the work areas. So that when you hit save and close, I'm able to see payables now. Now, if you go to manage invoices, remember guys, AP invoice means a payables invoice. It's a payment that we need to make to a supplier for the goods or services that we have bought. I'm going to search for invoices for a specific supplier. Show me the invoices we created for ABC Consulting in the last 60 days. Let's see that there's only one invoice. Let's do it this way. I'm going to do the search again. I'm going to increase the range. Okay, looks like we don't have any invoices for this specific supplier. That's okay. So when you open up an invoice here, what exactly do you see, guys? First of all, you have invoice header details. Okay, and in the invoice header, what do we mention, guys? We mention invoice date, which type of invoice it is, what's the supplier, what's the site, okay, and what's the address. And we also have invoice amount. And what is invoice amount going to be, guys? It is going to be the sum of line totals. So if we have two lines here, 2000 and 2500, and the sum of these two lines is what you're going to see here. And yes, we're creating it as creating it in US1 business unit. And we mention the payment terms, currency. And when you create a invoice header, we mention the invoice details, supplier details, currency. And we would have one invoice could have multiple lines. And if there are any holds or approval related information, that would be there in this tab. And once you make a payment to the sub invoice, the payment details would be captured here. And remember, when we make a payment to a supplier, right, normally depending on the payment terms, the installments would be paid out. Say, for example, if we have an option to pay the amount in 2 or 3 installments, you have those installment details here. If the payment terms is immediate, what does it mean, guys? It means that I have to make an immediate payment of this much amount to the supplier. And we can also store the distribution details. So when you create an AP invoice from, we are going to create AP invoice in ERP. And when you create AP invoice in ERP Cloud, we can create an invoice with all these details, guys. We can create an invoice with invoice header details, first of all. We can add attachment if we need. And we can add load data into DFF attributes. We can load data into installments tab, and we can load the lines as well. And within the lines again, we have the distribution related information. So what I did is I copied the sample payload, guys, and I've taken out all the optional fields. And after I take out all the optional fields, what exactly I've got? So if you go to this 8.AP invoice payloads folder, and you go into this create AP invoice request payload JSON file, open it with the text editor. And here you would be able to see the invoice header details. So you see the invoice header details, and you also see the invoice line details. Remember, I've taken out installment and other optional fields. We don't need them. So I've mentioned invoice details here. Let me change the invoice number to UG63. So what exactly this is going to do, guys? So if I use this payload, my expectation is that this invoice is created in ERP in US1 BU against this consulting supplier with an amount of 2,500. And there should be 2 lines on the invoice created, one with amount 2,000, another one with amount 500. And since we could have multiple lines on an invoice, we need to add this as a repeating array. So I'm going to copy this sample payload, and I'm going to enter it here. So when I receive the payload from the other system where AP invoice is generated, I want to receive the payload in the specific format. And when you hit this standard API, remember, guys, when you hit this create AP invoice REST API, guys, when you hit this create endpoint with this payload, we would get this response payload. So what I did is I just hit the standard API using this request payload. And when I use this request payload, I'm going to get the response in this particular format. Now you copy this response, and I'm going to put that in here. So we are in a response tab now. Response is a JSON sample. Sorry, request payload is done. We entered it in line. And we can go ahead and enter a sample response. And in the response, you enter sample JSON response, and you enter it in line. And you enter the payload there. Continue. Remember, we added one operation so far, right? But why are we seeing this option to add another operation? Because in the first node itself, what did we say? We said we wanted to configure multiple verbs or operations. Since I said I wanted to configure multiple verbs or operations, you see this additional option showing up. So I can select this add another operation option, continue. And this time I'm going to configure the get endpoint, guys. This time I'm going to configure the get endpoint. So for the get endpoint, we're going to do a get AP invoice details. And I would say that this operation okay, so this will fetch AP invoice details from ERP cloud. And what exactly are you going to mention as URI, guys? Relative resource URI. So we would say get AP invoice details. And I'm going to mention it as a get endpoint. And remember, guys, to this particular endpoint, I want to receive invoice ID as input. And I'm going to enter this invoice ID. What are you going to enter this invoice ID, guys? I'm going to enter it as a template parameter. I'm going to enter it as a template parameter like this. I'm going to enter it as a template parameter like this, invoices ID. Now, why exactly is the case? Because since the invoice ID that I'm going to receive as input here would help me find only one record in the database table. So that's why I need to configure this as a template parameter. And it is a get endpoint. I will also configure this endpoint to send the response back. Because remember, guys, from this branch also, we want to send the response back. So we say get endpoint, and you're able to see this template parameter created. And you also see the template parameter created. Just give me one moment, guys. So well, invoice ID is added as a template parameter. Continue. And I'm going to enter this as a sample JSON payload. So you enter it as sample JSON, and we enter it as inline. So I'm going to copy remember, guys, create AP invoice response payload is that, right? Response payload. So that exact same response payload also works for get endpoint, because even if you hit the get endpoint, guys, even if you hit the get endpoint given by Oracle, even if you hit this endpoint, yes, after the invoice is created, whatever details are there in ERP Cloud created for that invoice, all the details will come back. And even if you hit the get an invoice endpoint, you would get all the details of invoice back here. Okay. Now I'm going to say continue. And I say continue. You see that there are two branches created. So from one single integration that we are building in OIC, I'm just trying to expose two endpoints here. But how many more operations I can add, guys? I can add up to 11 operations. What if you need more? If you need more, you create a new REST API. Continue. And you see two operations, create and get. And for each operation again, you have this is a post endpoint and this is a get endpoint. This is a get endpoint. Both of them have a response, and we click on finish. Now, what exactly do you see here? I can just click on cancel here. And what exactly do you see here? You see that there are two branches added automatically. One branch would help you. One is a post branch, which would help you to create AP invoice, and the other one is get branch, which would receive invoice ID as input, and we should get the invoice details back and send the response back, send the details back. Now, what exactly do we need to do in this one, guys? From the get branch, sorry, from the post branch, what do we need to do? We need to go ahead and use ERP Cloud connection. Remember, in the first branch, I'll show you how to use ERP connection to create AP invoice, and in the second one, we'll see how to use REST invoke connection. So we say create AP invoice in ERP Cloud. Go to the next screen, and we say perform CRUD operations in cloud. Continue. And this time I want to call the REST APIs. And it is an FSCM REST API that I want to call, not a CRM or HCM related one. And what's the resource name, guys? Invoices. I'll search for that. Continue. Now, what operation do we want to do in invoices branch, guys? I want to create an AP invoice. So I'm selecting invoices resource and I'm saying create. Now, when I want to create an AP invoice, remember I can create an invoice with all these details. So I just want to create an invoice with lines. I could select other options as well. It depends on what other information you receive from the source system. And I don't need any distributions to be imported. I just say create an AP invoice. So I'm using ERP Cloud Connection. I'm asking OIC to go to ETAQ instance and create an AP invoice there. Click on finish. And the moment I click on finish, what exactly would you see here? You would be able to see the AP invoice details here when you get into the mapper. You see the invoices here and you see the request wrapper. And within the request wrapper, what exactly do you see, guys? You see the invoice details. You see the line details as a repeating element. Where is this payload coming in from, guys? So in the create endpoint,
sample JSON.
Yeah, in the create endpoint or post endpoint, I've entered this as a sample JSON. Now we need to go ahead and do the mapping. And you map the repeating lines. So for the lines, do we need to map the repeating row, guys? What would happen if you don't map the repeating row?
Looping will not be created.
Looping will not work, and only the first line will be passed as input.
Yep.
Now, only when you map this repeating row, what would happen? If an invoice has 2 lines, it would loop through. You know that for each loop would be added on top of this, right? So that would loop through all the lines and invoice gets created with all the lines. And go ahead and save it. Now, after the invoice is created, we would also get back a response, guys. We will also get back a response. And in that response, you have invoice details. Now, what exactly we need to do? We need to map some of those invoice details and send it back in the response here. So get into the mapper, guys. So in the sample, in the trigger node, I have entered this as a sample response payload. Now, when we create AP invoice, we send out a request to create AP invoice, and we were getting a response. And from the response payload, I can pick up the fields. So in real time, what do? We map all these fields and send it back as a response or whatever fields that your client needs. In the interest of time, let's do it this way, guys. I'll map only a few important fields here, not all of them. I'm also mapping the line attributes from the response, and I just want to send it back. I'm just mapping few important fields here, guys. I'm not mapping all of them. Now we need to repeat the same thing here, or we need to plug in logic here in the get branch. In the get branch, what would happen, guys? We get the invoice ID as input, and for that invoice ID, I want to get the invoice details from ERP Cloud. Can I make use of ERP connection, guys? I can still make use of ERP connection, guys, to get the invoice details as well. So I can just select REST resources here, FSCM, invoices. And what endpoint do I need to select here, guys? You see that there are 2 endpoints here, get all and get. Get all means it is going to fetch all the invoices. So it is this endpoint, and get means it is this endpoint. So if I have to get this endpoint, hit this endpoint, what do I have to do? I just have to go in here and I have to select the get method. So I can go ahead and make use of ERP cloud connection even in the get branch as well, guys. It would still work. But I want to show you an alternate approach to invoke the REST APIs. I want to show you an alternate approach to invoke the REST APIs, which is to use a REST invoke connection. So remember, we created this REST invoke connection, right? And I want to make use of that REST invoke connection here. I've created this REST invoke connection. I'll make use of that REST invoke connection here, ERP REST connection. And I'll say create, get AP invoice, details from ERP. And what exactly do we want to do? What is the endpoints relative response URI? So here you are going to say invoice. Now, what exactly, where do I get this URI from, guys? In a REST invoke connection, guys, the URI is the most important factor. So depending on which exact REST API do you want to call, you need to mention that particular endpoint here. Okay, now what REST endpoint do I want to call, guys? I want to call this REST endpoint, right? This path I want to call. And to this path, what do I need to prefix, guys? ERP cloud instance URL, right? But in the connection, I already have this ERP connection URL. So which means if I use this connection and if I mention this path here, to this path, whatever base URL you have in the connection will be added to this. And that is exactly how we would be doing it. That is exactly what we need as well, right? So I'm going to say get endpoint. And yes, we need to pass an invoice ID as input parameter. And we will configure this endpoint to receive the response. So we say JSON sample. I'm going to enter this. Even for the get endpoint, the same create AP invoice response payload would work, guys. So the response payload is same for both the endpoints, for create as well as for get. So I'm configuring a get endpoint. I've configured the response payload as well. I just have to do the handshake. See, remember, I'm going to get the invoice ID as input, and I have to map it as input to the REST API. And this REST API, so I'm calling a get AP invoice REST API endpoint using the REST adapter here. And this is going to get me back a response, and I can get into the response here, and I can map whatever are the invoice details we have got back from ERP cloud. Remember, there was a request that we are sending out. You see a response, and in the response, you have all the invoice details. And I'm going to send the same details back here. Okay. So in the usually in real time, what do we do, guys? We map all the details, or at least most of them, and we send the details back. But in the interest of time, what do? We'll just map few important parameters and leave out the other ones. In real time, you would be mapping all the other fields and send the details back. Now, since this is a REST API with multiple branches, guys, first of all, you don't see an option to enable tracking from here. You don't see the tracking option there. Instead, we need to enable tracking identifier from at every branch. Okay, so for the post branch, let me enable the identifier. I want to use invoice number as a tracking field, business unit as a second one, and supplier as a third one. So I've enabled tracking identifiers on both the endpoints, and we go ahead and activate it. Debug, and I'm going to activate. Now, after we activate the endpoint, tell me one thing, guys. When you create a REST API like this with two branches, and when you activate it, would one endpoint URL be generated or two separate endpoint URLs get generated, guys? What's the guess? Two separate endpoint URLs. So if you want to see those URLs, you click on run here, and you click on endpoint metadata. So you would be able to see that there is one endpoint URL for create AP invoice. And there's also and you see for this endpoint, this is a request payload and this is a response payload. And you also see that there is a second endpoint generated for get endpoint URL. You also see the request, and you don't need to pass in any request here. We just have a response sample, and in the response sample, you see the invoice details. Okay, so you see the endpoints and you see the request and response payloads. Okay, so we go ahead and cancel it. Now, can we just assume that this integration is going to work as expected and share the URLs with them, guys? Not really, right? We have to do the unit testing first. So I go into a post endpoint first. Let's test the integration and see if it works as expected first. Only then we will share the endpoint URLs with the client. So let's create an invoice first. So I'm testing the post endpoint. So we need to pass in a sample payload here. Okay, so the payload so the payload that the other system is going to pass in, right? So the other system is going to invoke our integration, and they're going to pass in this payload. So if they want AP invoice in ERP Cloud to be created over this number, 2,500 amount and so on. Now let me first check if this AP invoice exists in ERP Cloud, guys. We don't see AP invoice, right, with that number. So we'll go ahead and fire off a request. Now what would happen? AP invoice in ERP Cloud should be created in ERP Cloud. Sorry, AP invoice should be created in ERP Cloud, and we need to get back a response. So you see, guys, we've got back a response here. You see the response here, and you have the invoice details here, the business unit and the supplier details, and you also have the lines information. Now you also see that there is an instance ID generated, and if you click on instance ID, you would be able to see the path into which integration has gone into. Since I hit the post endpoint, it went into the post branch, and it has created AP invoice in ERP, and it has mapped some of the details and sent it back in the response. Now, what is client going to do? They want to do a cross verification. They want to check if this invoice ID really corresponds to the invoice details or not. How do they check it? We've given them a get endpoint for it. So they're going to use a get endpoint, and they pass an invoice ID as input, fire off a request. Now, what do we see here? We see that there is a response here. And in the response, we're going to print only few important invoice header details. We're not going to print everything. We print only few important invoice header details here. Since I mapped only few fields, I'm seeing only those fields in the response. And for this invoice ID, the details that we have got is exactly matching with what we have sent as input. Now you click on instance ID. And when you click on instance ID, what do you see? You hit the get end. We hit the get endpoint. We passed an invoice ID. Through the REST invoke connection, we were able to fetch the invoice details, and we were sending the details back here, the response. Okay, so now that these two REST endpoints are working as expected, what do we do, guys? We go ahead and send out a detailed email to the client, to the third party, saying that, boss, these are the REST endpoints that you need to call. This is a REST endpoint for create API, and this is a sample request and response payloads. And you would also be entering the get endpoint, enter the request payload. Sorry, for the get endpoint, we only have to pass an invoice ID, and we also map the response payload as well. Okay, so these are the details that we have to enter. So we have to share with the client. And what client is going to do is client is going to trigger our REST API. Client is going to trigger our REST API endpoint URLs from another application where AP invoices are created. But since we don't have a client to invoke our REST API from another application, we will try to mimic it by using a postman tool, a testing tool, as if client is triggering our REST APIs from outside of OIC, from another application. Now, what endpoint do we need, guys, first of all, for this? We need the get endpoint, create endpoint. Shall we try first? So we try the create endpoint. And what's the method that we need to use for create, guys? We need to use a post method. So I say post method, and I enter the URL. Do we have to pass in authentication details? Of course.
Yes.
And what else do we need to match?
Payload. Request payload.
Yeah, I've copied the password and I'm going to paste it in here and in the request payload. So this is where we need to pass in the request payload. Now tell me one thing, guys. We are calling the standard REST API given by Oracle from within the integration, right? Do you think that REST API is going to do the validations, guys? We're making use of the standard REST API given by Oracle, right, to create an invoice.
Yes.
Do you think this endpoint is going to do the validation?
I think it should do.
It should, right? So let's see if it does or not. So what we do was we use the same payload. We try to create an invoice with the same number that already exists in the cloud. What's the expectation?
Duplicate.
So first of all, we have got a we have got an internal server error. So why did internal server error go, guys? First of all, because we didn't do the fault handling in this integration. And please note, guys, we're not going to talk about fault handling again in the course. We've already done it for 2 hours in the AP invoice, journal input service as an example. We would not be getting into it again. But please note that whenever you build any integration in OIC, ensure that you plug in fault handling. Since we didn't do the fault handling, internal server error has been sent back to the calling client. So if a custom application on the client side calls our REST API, this server error is what we are what we're going to send back. Do we send such internal server errors back, guys? Usually, it doesn't make sense, right? Because it doesn't look good as well. So we need to capture it and we need to send out a relevant error message. And you see this error details. So these are the error details that we have got. What does the error says? What does the error says, guys? It says that this invoice number already exists. You must provide an unique invoice number. It tells you very clearly what the problem is. It tells you very clearly what the problem is. And in the case of title, it was saying internal server error, and it was the code was going out as 400. The code was going out as 400. 500 is what you see here, and 400 is a code that you see internally. Now, would we be able to see this request in OIC, guys? First of all,
yes.
Observability. If we go to observability, REST APIs, you could see that it has ended in error state. Why did it end in error state, guys? Because when we try to, with a payload that we have passed in, when AP invoice is attempted to be created, we have got a fault here. Now, what does the error says? The same error that you have seen earlier. So it says, you should be able to see the details here. Click on the payload. Yeah. So when you expand it, you see the details here. So you see the same error here. Now, since we didn't do a fault handling, since we don't do the fault handling, this was whatever error we've got here. There's no scope, and we didn't configure global fault handler, so that's why it was sent back. What else I could have done, guys? To handle this scenarios like this, what else I could have done?
Enable global fault handler.
Created a scope
Global
and
fault.
then
Yeah, scope also is required, right? So I'm going to clone this integration and I'll tell you what exactly you should have done. I'm not going to test it again, but I'll just show you what exactly you need to do. I'm going to cut all three and I'm going to paste this into the sheet here. I'm going to paste it into the sheet. Now into the scope. Now that I have a fault handler configured here, what I can do, I can configure a default handler. And from a default handler, what we can do, guys, since this is a REST API and created as a synchronous service, you see a response element at the end. So what I can add, guys, I can add or I can return a fault. So when you look at a return, there are two things that we can do. We can send out a normal return, meaning it's a successful completion, or I can send a fault return. When I send a fault return, remember we didn't see a fault return in the journal input scope. Why didn't we see it, guys? Because it was a synchronous service. There was a stop node at the end. If it is a synchronous, you can send a fault return. And when you send a fault return, what do we want to do, guys? We of course need to mention with what error type. Okay, so what is the error type that you want to send? What title, what detail, what error code, what are the details that we want to send? And within the details, again, you have all these details. So whatever exact details that you want to send back in the error, you can mention this. So for example, if I say existed and say I want to send the title as error while creating AP invoice in ERP Cloud. Okay. Now what's the error code, guys? Where do we get the error code from? So we don't see any error code here. So the if you look at the, since we are within the fault handler, right, we get access to a fault object, right? And you have the details here, the error code, reason, and the details. So what I can do is I can map these three and I can map these details to this. I can map the details here. Okay. And we can send the details back. Error reason also you can send if you want, and you can send the details. So this way you can send the details back from the fault handler. So this way, what would happen now? So what is the error code that is going to go? Whatever error code that is raised here, that error code would go. Okay, so this way you can do a fault handling, and from within the fault handler, since it is a synchronous operation, we can also do a fault return as well instead of doing a normal return. But what do we do here? We go back to this one. So we go back to the postman. Now, how do we fix this? Since the invoice already exists, I'll just change it to 2. Should this go through now, guys? Since this invoice number doesn't exist, it should go through now successfully. And we should also be able to see AP invoices created here. So you search for AP invoice now, you see 2 invoices created. So this is the first one we created from within OIC, and this is from outside of OIC. And you should be able to see that invoice has all the details. You see the invoice details and the lines information within them. And you see the invoice header and the lines information within them. Now we've also got back the invoice ID, right? So we can also do a testing as well, guys. How do we test it? We go to the endpoint metadata. We copy the get endpoint URL. Remember, it is a get endpoint URL. And I paste it in here. And I select a get method. I go into the post here, copy the invoice ID, and I'm going to mention this here. And we need to pass in the authorization details. Fire off a request, and we're going to get back the invoice details now. So since the invoice corresponds to 2, We see the details here. And we should be able to see all of it captured in the instances here. So these two are from within OIC, and from outside of OIC, we did the error testing. And from outside of OIC, when client invokes our integration, this is the behavior you get to see. Any questions, guys, from anyone? Try this one out, guys, and let me know tomorrow. Thank you.